You've made it to the middle of the course now. We've completed our exploration of credential-based attacks through phishing and credential stuffing. Now we're shifting to a fundamentally different attack vector, social engineering. Social engineering is the art of manipulating people into divulging information or performing actions that compromise security. Unlike technical attacks that exploit software vulnerabilities, social engineering exploits human psychology. It bypasses firewalls, encryption, and authentication systems by convincing people to simply hand over access. This lesson covers the psychological principles that make social engineering effective and why even security-conscious individuals fall victim to these attacks. At its core, social engineering leverages the fact that humans are social creatures who cooperate, trust, and respond to social cues. These traits that make societies function are the same traits that attackers weaponize. These are not weaknesses or character flaws. They're normal human responses to social situations. Much of social engineering can be understood through Robert Cialdini's 6 Principles of Influence, which he documented in his book, Influence: The Psychology of Persuasion. He talked about reciprocity, commitment and consistency, social proof, authority, liking, and scarcity. Let's briefly go through each of these. For reciprocity, we often feel obligated to return favors. If someone does something for us, we feel psychological pressure to reciprocate. Attackers exploit this by doing small favors before making requests. They might help you with the problem, share information, or offer assistance, creating a sense of obligation that makes you more likely to comply with their later requests. For commitment and consistency, once we commit to something, we feel pressure to behave consistently with that commitment. Attackers use this by getting you to agree to small initial requests, then escalating to larger requests. Having agreed to the first request, you feel inconsistent refusing the second. For social proof, we often look to others' behavior to guide our own actions, especially in uncertain situations. Attackers exploit this by claiming everyone else has already done it, or your colleagues have all provided this information. This implication that others have complied makes you more likely to comply too. For authority, we're conditioned from childhood to obey authority figures. Some of us are. Attackers impersonate authorities, executives, IT staff, law enforcement, government officials, because we instinctively comply with perceived authority without sufficient verification. For liking, we're more likely to comply with requests from people we like or find similar to ourselves in some way. Attackers build rapport, find common ground, mirror your communication style, and present themselves as friendly and relatable to increase compliance. For scarcity, we perceive things as more valuable when they're rare or limited. Attackers create artificial scarcity. This offer expires today. Only a few spots remaining. Urgent deadline. To pressure hasty decisions without careful evaluation. These principles work because they tap into these deep psychological patterns. Understanding them intellectually doesn't make you immune. You'll still feel the psychological pressure, even when you recognize the tactic. Authority bias deserves special attention because it's one of the most powerful and commonly exploited psychological principles. Research shows that people will comply with requests from perceived authority figures, even when those requests are unreasonable or harmful. The famous Milgram experiments demonstrated that ordinary people would administer what they believed were dangerous electric shocks to others simply because an authority figure instructed them to do so. In social engineering contexts, attackers exploit authority bias by impersonating executives, IT support, law enforcement, government officials, auditors, or vendors with contractual authority. The authority doesn't need to be real, it just needs to be perceived. An attacker who sounds confident, uses appropriate jargon, and claims authority will often be obeyed without verification. This works because questioning authority creates social discomfort. Some people worry about appearing insubordinate, difficult, or paranoid. We don't want to offend someone who might actually have authority, so we comply rather than verify. Creating urgency is a fundamental social engineering tactic that exploits how stress affects decision-making. When we feel rushed, pushed or pressured. Our cognitive functions change. Critical thinking decreases. We rely more on instinct and less on analyses. We prioritize speed over accuracy. We take shortcuts and make assumptions we wouldn't make under calmer conditions. Attackers deliberately create urgency through artificial deadlines, manufactured crises, and appeals to fear. The urgency prevents you from taking time to verify the request, consult with others, or think critically about whether the situation makes sense. Fear is one of the most powerful emotions for driving behavior, and social engineers exploit it ruthlessly. Fear of negative consequences makes people take protective actions without careful evaluation. When we're afraid, we don't want to be afraid anymore. We want to fix the problem immediately, eliminate the threat. And of course, the action the attacker wants us to take creates the exact harm they're claiming to prevent very often. Human curiosity is a powerful motivator that attackers exploit to get victims to click links, open attachments, or engage with malicious content. We have a strong psychological drive to close information gaps. If someone claims to have information about us, we want to know what they're talking about. This curiosity can override our better judgment. Clicking suspicious links because we want to know what's behind them. Opening attachments to satisfy our curiosity. And engaging with questionable contacts because we want to understand what they want. Attackers create compelling mysteries and information gaps specifically designed to trigger this curiosity response. A lot of people are inherently helpful and want to trust others. Those pro-social behaviors that make society function are vulnerabilities in security contexts. Attackers deliberately present themselves as likable, relatable, and in need of help to trigger these pro-social responses. Beyond Cialdini's principles, social engineering exploits numerous cognitive biases. Confirmation bias makes us seek information that confirms our existing beliefs and ignore information that contradicts them. If an attacker's story aligns with something we're already thinking about or expecting, we're more likely to believe it without verification. Availability bias makes us judge likelihood based on how easily examples come to mind. If we've recently heard about a type of security threat, we're more likely to believe claims about that threat, making us vulnerable to social engineering that exploits current fears. Anchoring bias makes us rely too heavily on the first piece of information we receive. Attackers use this by establishing an initial frame or assumption that colors how we interpret subsequent information. Normalcy bias makes us underestimate the likelihood of threats and assume things will continue as they always have. This makes us dismissive of warning signs and less likely to recognize social engineering attempts. These biases operate automatically and unconsciously. Just knowing about them does not prevent them from affecting your judgment. We have an illusion of invulnerability. Most people believe they're less susceptible to social engineering than they actually are. Research shows that people consistently overestimate their ability to detect deception and resist manipulation. Security professionals, people who should know better, fall for social engineering at rates comparable to general populations when tested. This overconfidence is dangerous. If you believe you're immune to manipulation, you won't maintain appropriate skepticism. The most skilled social engineers can manipulate highly intelligent, security-aware individuals. Intelligence and knowledge provide some protection, but it's not immunity. Social engineering effectiveness is heavily influenced by context and environmental factors. Time pressure, multitasking, fatigue, stress, distraction, and emotional states all reduce our ability to think critically and recognize manipulation. Attackers deliberately target victims during these vulnerable periods. They call at the end of the workday when you're tired and rushing to finish. They contact you during busy periods when you're juggling multiple priorities. They strike during organizational changes when confusion is high and skepticism is low. The physical and social environment matters too. People are more susceptible to social engineering in public spaces where they feel social pressure to appear competent and avoid making scenes. teams. They're more vulnerable in hierarchical organizations where questioning authority is discouraged. There's a powerful insight from the psychologist and behavioral economist Daniel Kahneman, who wrote in his book, Thinking, Fast and Slow. A reliable way to make people believe in falsehoods is frequent repetition, because familiarity is not easily distinguished from truth. Authoritarian institutions and marketers have always known this fact. Kahneman's observation explains a core social engineering principle. What feels familiar feels true. Attackers exploit this by using familiar formats, impersonating familiar organizations, referencing familiar contexts, and leveraging familiar social dynamics. When a social engineering attempt feels familiar, it looks like emails you've received before. It sounds like calls you've gotten before. It resembles legitimate interactions. Your brain categorizes it as trustworthy without conscious evaluation. This is why even sophisticated social engineering attempts often use familiar templates and scenarios. They're not trying to be original. They're trying to trigger that automatic, this feels normal response that bypasses critical thinking. So all this reveals that fundamental limitation of technical security approaches, because we're not dealing with the technical, we're dealing with this human psychology. And like we talked about, awareness provides intellectual knowledge, but social engineering exploits automatic psychological responses, making security awareness training less effective than it otherwise would be. Attackers don't need you to be unaware. They just need you to feel the psychological pressure strongly enough that you act on it despite your awareness. It does not mean that awareness is useless, though. Awareness still helps, but it's just not a complete defense. When organizations treat awareness training as a complete solution, they are dangerously mistaken. Effective social engineers think like psychologists and actors. They study human behavior, understand what motivates people, identify individual vulnerabilities, craft compelling narratives, and adapt their approach based on victim responses. They can't rely on scripts. They have to improvise based on psychological principles and real-time feedback, reading your responses and adjusting tactics to maximize compliance. So vulnerability is universal. Everyone is vulnerable to social engineering under the right circumstances. You might be highly skeptical of phone calls, but vulnerable to emails. You might be resistant to urgency, but vulnerable to appeals to authority. You might be skeptical when you're calm, but vulnerable when you're stressed or distracted. And social engineers are patient. They'll try different approaches until they find the one that works on you, waiting for the right moment when your defenses are down. So recognizing that you are vulnerable, that you have psychological characteristics that can be exploited, is the first step toward meaningful defense. If you've heard the saying, the bigger they are, the harder they fall, people love going after people who think they're invulnerable. So when someone creates urgency, recognize it as manipulation. When someone invokes authority, verify. When someone tries to be overly friendly or helpful, maintain professional skepticism. When you're feeling any emotional pressure, pause and analyze. Awareness at least gives you the opportunity to recognize what's happening and choose a rational response rather than an emotional one. In our next lesson, we'll explore how attackers use reconnaissance and pretexting to make their social engineering attempts convincing and targeted.